The morning sun cast long shadows across the South Dakota plains as Marcus Red Hawk adjusted his backpack straps. He had been walking for 3 hours since dawn, his worn boots finding their rhythm on the dusty trail that wound through the Badlands. The 28-year-old Lakota man moved with purpose, his dark eyes scanning the horizon for the familiar landmarks that would guide him to his grandmother's cabin. Marcus had made this journey countless times as a child, but today felt different. The weight of his recent job loss in Denver pressed heavily on his shoulders, and the decision to return home carried both hope and uncertainty. His grandmother, Elena, had called him 2 weeks ago with news that their family's sacred land was being threatened by developers. She needed his help to document the ancestral burial sites before the legal battle intensified. As he walked, Marcus noticed how the landscape seemed to whisper stories of his ancestors. The red rock formations stood like ancient sentinels, and the wind carried scents of sage and wild grass that triggered childhood memories. His grandfather had taught him to read these signs, to understand the language of the earth that many had forgotten in their rush toward modern life. The trail began to climb toward a ridge where his grandmother's cabin sat hidden among a grove of cottonwood trees. Marcus quickened his pace, eager to see Elena after months of city living that had left him feeling disconnected from his roots. His phone had lost signal hours ago, but he welcomed the silence. In Denver, he had been constantly checking emails, rushing to meetings, living by schedules that never seemed to align with his natural rhythms. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing across the valley. Marcus paused to watch its graceful flight, remembering his grandfather's words about how the hawk was a messenger, bringing warnings and wisdom to those who knew how to listen. The bird's presence felt significant, though he couldn't yet understand why. As he approached the final stretch of trail, Marcus saw smoke rising from his grandmother's chimney. The sight filled him with warmth and anticipation. Elena Red Hawk was 73 years old but possessed a spirit that seemed ageless. She had raised Marcus after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12, teaching him the old ways while encouraging his education in the modern world. The cabin came into view, its weathered wood blending naturally with the surrounding trees. Marcus could see his grandmother's vegetable garden where corn, beans, and squash grew in the traditional Three Sisters pattern. Chickens pecked at the ground near a small shed, and an old brown dog lifted its head to watch his approach. Marcus called out in Lakota as he reached the porch steps, announcing his arrival in the traditional way. The screen door swung open, and Elena emerged with a smile that seemed to light up her entire face. She was smaller than he remembered, her silver hair braided down her back, wearing a simple blue dress and beaded earrings that caught the sunlight. Their embrace lasted long minutes, both understanding without words how much this reunion meant. Elena stepped back to study her grandson's face, her knowing eyes taking in the stress lines that hadn't been there during his last visit. She invited him inside, where the familiar sense of burning sage and fresh bread welcomed him home. Over coffee and Elena's homemade fry bread, Marcus learned more details about the threat facing their land. A development company had been quietly purchasing properties in the area, planning to build a luxury resort and golf course. They claimed the family's 200 acres contained no significant historical sites, dismissing the burial grounds that had been sacred to the Lakota for generations. Elena explained that the legal process required documented proof of the site's historical significance. She had been working with a team of archaeologists and historians, but the developers were pushing for quick approval of their plans. Time was running short, and Elena needed Marcus's help to complete a comprehensive survey of the entire property. As they talked, Marcus felt the familiar tension he experienced whenever ancient traditions collided with modern legal systems. His college education had taught him to navigate both worlds, but the challenge always remained finding ways to translate spiritual significance into language that courts would recognize and protect. The afternoon passed quickly as Elena showed Marcus the files and maps she had compiled. Aerial photographs revealed subtle patterns in the landscape that suggested extensive historical use of the area. Ground-penetrating radar had identified several promising locations, but much of the work still required careful walking surveys to identify surface artifacts and features. Elena suggested they begin the survey work the following morning, starting with the eastern section of the property where recent erosion had exposed some interesting stone formations. She warned Marcus that the work would be slow and methodical, requiring patience and careful observation skills that seemed increasingly rare in their fast-paced world. As evening approached, Marcus helped his grandmother prepare dinner, falling easily back into the rhythms of cabin life. They ate by lamplight, sharing stories and catching up on family news. Elena spoke about other tribal members who were facing similar challenges, developers targeting native lands across the region with increasing frequency. Outside, coyotes began their evening chorus, their voices mixing with the sound of wind through the cottonwoods. Marcus sat on the porch listening to these familiar sounds while Elena prepared tobacco for her evening prayers. The stars appeared more brilliant here than anywhere he had seen them in the city, the Milky Way stretching across the sky like a pathway between worlds. Before retiring, Elena handed Marcus a pair of his grandfather's old walking boots, worn leather that would serve him better than his modern hiking shoes on the rough terrain they would cover. She also gave him a small pouch of tobacco and sweetgrass, reminding him to offer prayers for guidance as they searched for signs of their ancestors. As Marcus settled into his childhood bedroom, he reflected on how different this place felt from his Denver apartment. Here time moved at the pace of seasons rather than seconds, and every sound carried meaning beyond mere noise. He drifted off to sleep, planning the systematic approach they would take to documenting the sacred sites, unaware that tomorrow would bring discoveries that would change everything he thought he knew about both his family's history and his own future. Dawn broke with a symphony of birdsong that served as Marcus's natural alarm clock. He found Elena already awake in the kitchen, brewing coffee and packing supplies for their first day of survey work. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had lived close to the land for decades, gathering items that Marcus wouldn't have thought to bring. The morning air carried a crisp bite that reminded Marcus of autumn's approach. Elena handed him a thermos of coffee and a canvas bag containing water bottles, energy bars, notebooks, pencils, measuring tape, and small paper bags for collecting any artifacts they might discover. She also included her grandfather's eagle feather, wrapped carefully in red cloth, explaining that they would need to conduct proper ceremonies if they found anything significant. They set out toward the eastern boundary of the property, following a barely visible path that wound between granite outcroppings and stands of pine trees. Elena moved with surprising agility for her age, her steps sure and confident on terrain that would challenge much younger people. Marcus found himself working to keep pace with her steady rhythm. As they walked, Elena shared stories about the land that had been passed down through generations. She pointed out specific rock formations where vision quests had taken place, areas where medicinal plants grew in abundance, and subtle depressions in the ground that marked the sites of ancient teepees. To untrained eyes, these features might appear random or natural, but Elena's knowledge revealed layers of human history stretching back centuries. The first significant discovery came within 2 hours of beginning their search. Elena stopped suddenly near a cluster of large boulders, her weathered hand pointing toward what appeared to be random scratches on the rock surface. Marcus approached cautiously, following her instructions to look carefully at the marks from different angles as the morning light shifted across the stone. Gradually, the scratches resolved into deliberate patterns. Petroglyphs emerged from the weathered surface, depicting scenes of buffalo hunts, spiritual ceremonies, and astronomical observations. Elena explained that these images served multiple purposes, recording important events while also marking the location as sacred space. The complexity and preservation of the artwork suggested that this site had been significant for many generations. They spent the next 3 hours carefully documenting the petroglyphs, measuring their dimensions, photographing them from multiple angles, and recording their exact GPS coordinates. Elena insisted on traditional protocols, burning sage and offering tobacco to the spirits of the place before disturbing anything. She reminded Marcus that they were not simply collecting data, but engaging with their ancestors in a continuation of relationships that transcended death. As they worked, Elena noticed changes in the surrounding vegetation that indicated human modification of the landscape. Certain plants grew in patterns that suggested intentional cultivation, while others appeared in locations where they wouldn't naturally occur. She explained how indigenous peoples had shaped these environments over thousands of years, creating subtle but profound modifications that supported both human needs and ecological health. The midday sun grew intense, so they moved their work into the shade of a large overhanging rock. While eating lunch, Elena shared more details about the legal challenges they faced. The development company's lawyers had argued that any historical sites on the property were either too old to be relevant or too degraded to merit protection. They dismissed oral histories as unreliable and demanded scientific proof that would satisfy modern archaeological standards. Elena's frustration was evident as she described the impossible position this created. Traditional knowledge systems didn't separate spiritual significance from historical importance, and many sacred sites contained features that couldn't be easily measured or photographed. How could they document the importance of places where ceremonies had been conducted, but which left no physical traces that science would recognize? Marcus suggested that they focus on building the strongest possible case using methods that courts would accept, while also preparing cultural documentation that could support their legal arguments. His years in the corporate world had taught him to navigate bureaucratic systems, and he believed they could find ways to translate traditional knowledge into language that legal processes would recognize. The afternoon brought another significant discovery when Elena noticed unusual stone arrangements in a meadow, approximately half a mile from the petroglyphs. At first glance, the rocks appeared to be randomly scattered, but closer examination revealed a complex pattern that aligned with cardinal directions and specific astronomical phenomena. Elena explained that this was likely a medicine wheel, a sacred site used for ceremonies, healing, and teaching about the connection between earthly and cosmic forces. They spent hours mapping the stone circle, measuring distances between individual rocks and recording their orientations relative to important landmarks and celestial events. Elena demonstrated how the arrangement would have functioned as both a calendar and a ceremonial space, with different positions marking solstices, equinoxes, and other significant times in the yearly cycle. As they worked, Marcus began to understand how this landscape represented a complex system of knowledge preservation and spiritual practice. The seemingly random distribution of sites actually reflected sophisticated understanding of geography, astronomy, and ecology. Each location served multiple functions while connecting to a larger network of sacred places that extended across the entire region. The discovery of the medicine wheel energized both Elena and Marcus, but it also highlighted the urgency of their situation. Sites like this were incredibly rare and represented irreplaceable cultural resources. The thought of bulldozers destroying something that had taken centuries to create and maintain filled Marcus with anger that surprised him with its intensity. As evening approached, they made their way back toward the cabin, both exhausted but encouraged by the day's findings. Elena moved more slowly now, the day's exertion showing in her careful steps and frequent pauses to rest. Marcus offered to carry her pack, but she refused, explaining that the work required her to maintain proper relationship with the land through all aspects of their engagement. During their walk home, Elena shared concerns about her own health and stamina. At 73, she didn't know how many more opportunities she would have to document these sites before age or illness limited her mobility. The responsibility of preserving this knowledge weighed heavily on her, and she worried about what would happen to their family's cultural inheritance if they lost the legal battle. Marcus assured his grandmother that he would stay as long as necessary to complete the survey work, but privately he worried about his own financial situation. His savings would last several more weeks, but eventually he would need to find employment. The corporate world he had left behind seemed increasingly distant and irrelevant, but he wasn't sure what alternatives existed for someone with his background and education. That evening, they reviewed the day's documentation by lamplight, organizing photographs and notes into formats that could support their legal case. Elena insisted on traditional ceremonies to properly close their work with the sacred sites, burning sweetgrass and offering prayers of gratitude for the guidance they had received. She reminded Marcus that success in protecting the land would require both practical action and spiritual support. As Marcus prepared for sleep, he reflected on how the day had changed his understanding of both his family's history and his own relationship to the land. The discovery of the petroglyphs and medicine wheel felt like messages from ancestors who had faced their own struggles to preserve what mattered most. He fell asleep planning strategies for the following day's work, unaware that tomorrow would bring challenges that would test everything he thought he knew about courage, wisdom, and the price of protecting sacred places. The third day of their survey work began with an unexpected visitor. Marcus was helping Elena prepare breakfast when they heard the distant rumble of an engine approaching their remote cabin. Through the window, they watched a white pickup truck navigate the rough trail, its chrome bumper and pristine paint job contrasting sharply with the weathered landscape. Two men emerged from the vehicle, both wearing expensive suits that seemed completely inappropriate for the rural setting. The older man appeared to be in his 50s, with silver hair and confident posture that suggested he was accustomed to getting his way. His younger companion carried a briefcase and tablet computer, scanning the property with calculating eyes that seemed to price everything in sight. Elena stepped onto the porch to greet them, her manner polite but cautious. The older man introduced himself as Robert Hendricks, Regional Development Director for Mountain Vista Resort Corporation. He explained that they were conducting final site surveys before submitting their development proposal to the County Planning Commission and wanted to discuss potential concerns with local residents. Marcus joined his grandmother on the porch, immediately sensing the tension in her posture. Hendricks addressed most of his comments to Marcus rather than Elena, apparently assuming that business discussions required male participation. His tone remained friendly, but his words carried subtle implications that their cooperation would be appreciated while resistance would be futile. Hendricks explained that Mountain Vista planned to create a world-class resort destination that would bring jobs and economic development to the region. He acknowledged that some residents had expressed concerns about historical sites, but assured them that the company had conducted thorough archaeological surveys that found no significant cultural resources on the property. Elena listened quietly until Hendricks finished his presentation, then responded in a voice that carried decades of experience dealing with officials who dismissed indigenous concerns. She explained that their family had documentation of multiple sacred sites on the land, including recent discoveries that proved the area's historical significance. Her calm but firm manner seemed to catch Hendricks off guard. The developer's demeanor shifted subtly as Elena spoke, his professional smile becoming more strained. He acknowledged that Mountain Vista was aware of some local claims about historical sites, but emphasized that their legal team had researched all relevant regulations and found no impediments to development. He suggested that emotional attachments to family land, while understandable, couldn't override legitimate economic opportunities for the broader community. Marcus felt his anger rising as Hendricks continued to dismiss his grandmother's knowledge, but Elena's steady presence reminded him to remain calm and strategic. She invited the visitors inside for coffee, explaining that they had extensive documentation that might interest anyone conducting genuine archaeological surveys. In the cabin's main room, Elena spread out maps, photographs, and field notes from their recent discoveries. She methodically explained the significance of each site, using both traditional knowledge and modern archaeological terminology to describe what they had found. Her presentation was thorough and professional, clearly demonstrating that their claims were based on careful research rather than sentimental attachment. Hendricks examined the materials with growing discomfort, occasionally whispering with his assistant who took notes on his tablet. The evidence Elena presented was far more comprehensive than they had expected, and Marcus could see them calculating how these discoveries might complicate their development timeline. The younger man, introduced as Jenkins, asked pointed questions about the documentation process and whether Elena had submitted her findings to state archaeological authorities. His questions revealed familiarity with regulations governing cultural resource management, suggesting that Mountain Vista had dealt with similar challenges on other projects. Elena explained that she was working with tribal cultural preservation officials and planned to submit formal documentation to appropriate agencies once their survey work was complete. She emphasized that protection of sacred sites was not just a legal requirement but a moral obligation that transcended property ownership and economic interest. The atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense as the conversation continued. Hendricks began making veiled references to the legal complexities involved in challenging development projects, noting that expensive litigation rarely served anyone's interests. His words stopped just short of direct threats, but the implication was clear that Elena and Marcus would face significant legal and financial pressure if they pursued their claims. Marcus finally spoke up, his voice controlled but firm as he addressed Hendricks directly. He explained his own background in business and law, making it clear that they understood both the legal framework and their rights within it. His calm confidence seemed to surprise the developers, who had apparently expected to deal with elderly woman and her grandson, rather than sophisticated opposition. Elena asked Hendricks about Mountain Vista's corporate policies regarding indigenous cultural resources and community consultation. Her questions revealed deep understanding of environmental impact assessment requirements and federal regulations protecting tribal cultural sites. Hendricks provided evasive answers that made clear his company's minimal commitment to genuine consultation. As the meeting progressed, Marcus observed subtle signs of nervousness in both visitors. Jenkins checked his phone repeatedly, and Hendricks's questions became more aggressive as he probed for weaknesses in Elena's documentation. Their behavior suggested that the family's findings posed a more serious challenge to development plans than Mountain Vista had anticipated. The conversation took an ominous turn when Hendricks began asking personal questions about Elena's health and Marcus's employment situation. He expressed sympathetic concern about the financial burden of fighting large corporations, noting that elderly people often found legal stress overwhelming. His words were carefully chosen to avoid direct intimidation while clearly communicating the personal costs of resistance. Elena responded to these implied threats with the dignity and strength that had sustained her through decades of discrimination and official indifference. She explained that protecting sacred places was worth any personal sacrifice, and that their ancestors had faced far greater challenges in preserving cultural knowledge for future generations. Marcus felt proud of his grandmother's courage, but also worried about the practical implications of their confrontation with Mountain Vista. The company clearly had substantial resources and experience dealing with obstacles to their development projects. Their visit today demonstrated sophisticated intelligence gathering and strategic thinking that went far beyond simple business negotiations. After nearly 2 hours of increasingly tense discussion, Hendricks and Jenkins prepared to leave. They thanked Elena for her hospitality, while reiterating their hope that reasonable people could find mutually beneficial solutions to potential conflicts. Their departure felt more like a tactical withdrawal than a friendly conclusion to neighborly conversation. As the white pickup truck disappeared down the trail, Elena and Marcus sat in silence, processing what had just occurred. The developer's visit had transformed their documentation project from academic exercise into urgent legal and political battle. The stakes were now clear, and both sides understood that compromise was unlikely. Elena expressed concern about escalating pressure from Mountain Vista, noting that corporations often used intimidation tactics when local communities threatened profitable projects. She worried particularly about Marcus's safety, knowing that young Native men who challenged powerful interests sometimes faced serious consequences. Marcus assured his grandmother that he wouldn't be intimidated by corporate bullying, but privately he understood that they were now involved in something much larger and more dangerous than simple historical documentation. The afternoon's confrontation had revealed the true nature of their opposition and the sophisticated resources arrayed against their family's cultural heritage. As evening approached, they resumed their survey work with new urgency, knowing that time was running short, and that every day brought Mountain Vista closer to irreversible destruction of sites that had been sacred for centuries. The weight of responsibility felt heavier now, carrying not just family obligations but broader implications for indigenous rights and cultural preservation. The week following Mountain Vista's visit brought a series of escalating incidents that made clear the developers' determination to proceed with their project, regardless of Elena and Marcus's discoveries. The first sign of trouble came when their internet service mysteriously stopped working, followed by problems with their landline phone that the company claimed would take weeks to repair. Marcus drove to the nearest town to use public internet access and discovered that Mountain Vista had accelerated their timeline, submitting development applications to multiple agencies simultaneously. The company's public relations team had launched a media campaign emphasizing job creation and economic benefits, while downplaying any mention of potential archaeological concerns. More troubling was evidence that Mountain Vista was spreading misinformation about Elena and Marcus's work. Local newspapers published articles questioning the credibility of their archaeological claims, suggesting that family members had planted evidence to delay legitimate development. These stories cited unnamed experts who dismissed oral histories as scientifically unreliable. Elena received phone calls from neighbors who had been contacted by Mountain Vista representatives, offering substantial payments for statements, questioning the Red Hawk family's claims. Most refused, but the pressure campaign revealed the company's willingness to use divisive tactics that could destroy relationships within the community. The harassment escalated when Marcus discovered that someone had been trespassing on their property during nighttime hours. Fresh tire tracks appeared near their survey sites, and some of their carefully placed markers had been moved or removed entirely. Elena found tobacco offerings scattered and sage bundles disturbed, clear signs that their ceremonial activities were being monitored and disrupted. Marcus installed motion-activated cameras around the cabin and key archaeological sites, despite Elena's concerns about bringing surveillance technology into sacred spaces. The cameras quickly captured evidence of nighttime visitors who appeared to be conducting their own survey work, documenting the sites that Elena and Marcus had discovered. The most disturbing incident occurred when Marcus returned from a supply run to find Elena visibly shaken and reluctant to discuss what had happened. Eventually, she revealed that two men claiming to be federal agents had visited while he was away, demanding to examine their archaeological documentation and questioning her legal right to possess certain ceremonial items. Elena suspected the men were not genuine federal agents, noting inconsistencies in their credentials and behavior that suggested private security contractors hired by Mountain Vista. Their visit violated multiple laws regarding tribal cultural rights, but Elena feared that reporting the incident would escalate the situation beyond their ability to control. Marcus contacted a civil rights lawyer in Denver who specialized in indigenous issues, explaining the pattern of harassment they were experiencing. The attorney, Sarah Running Bear, agreed to review their case but warned that taking on a major development corporation would require significant resources and carry substantial personal risks. Sarah's preliminary research revealed that Mountain Vista had been involved in similar conflicts across the western United States, typically prevailing through a combination of legal pressure, political influence, and sustained harassment campaigns against local opponents. The company's parent corporation had connections to congressional representatives and federal agencies that complicated the regulatory landscape. Despite these challenges, Sarah agreed to file preliminary injunctions to halt development pending proper archaeological review of Elena and Marcus's findings. She emphasized that success would depend on presenting irrefutable scientific evidence while building broader political support for protecting the sacred sites. The legal strategy required expanding their documentation beyond what Elena and Marcus could accomplish alone. Sarah arranged for a team of professional archaeologists and anthropologists to conduct formal site evaluations that would meet federal standards for cultural resource protection. The work would be expensive, but several tribal organizations agreed to provide funding. Elena expressed mixed feelings about bringing outside experts to evaluate sites that her family had protected for generations. While she understood the legal necessity, the process felt like another form of colonization that required indigenous knowledge to be validated by non-native academics before being considered legitimate. The professional archaeological team arrived during a late September week when the aspens were turning golden and the air carried the crisp promise of winter. Led by Dr. Patricia Thornton, a respected specialist in Plains Indian archaeology, the team brought sophisticated equipment and methodical procedures that contrasted sharply with Elena's traditional approaches. Marcus found himself serving as translator between different knowledge systems as Elena worked with the professional archaeologists. Dr. Thornton was respectful and genuinely interested in learning from Elena's expertise, but the collaborative process revealed fundamental differences in how different cultures understood and valued historical evidence. The scientific survey confirmed and expanded upon Elena and Marcus's discoveries, documenting extensive evidence of long-term indigenous occupation and ceremonial use of the property. Ground-penetrating radar revealed additional buried features, while careful excavation of test units uncovered artifacts spanning several centuries of Native American presence. Most significantly, the archaeological team identified what appeared to be a major ceremonial complex centered around the medicine wheel Elena had discovered. The site showed evidence of continuous use from prehistoric times through the modern era, making it one of the most important indigenous cultural sites documented in the region. Dr. Thornton explained that sites of this significance typically received automatic protection under federal cultural resource laws, but noted that Mountain Vista would likely challenge their findings through expensive litigation designed to delay and discourage protection efforts. The company had probably calculated that Elena and Marcus lacked resources for prolonged legal battles. As the professional documentation neared completion, Marcus noticed increasing signs of surveillance around their property. Unfamiliar vehicles appeared regularly on nearby roads, and their motion cameras captured evidence of sophisticated nighttime monitoring using equipment that suggested professional intelligence gathering operations. Elena began experiencing health problems that she attributed to the stress of their situation combined with approaching winter weather. Her stamina decreased noticeably, and she struggled to maintain the demanding schedule of archaeological work while dealing with constant worry about their families' safety and financial situation. Marcus realized that their struggle had evolved beyond simple property disputes into a broader conflict over indigenous rights and cultural survival. Mountain Vista represented forces that had been threatening native communities for centuries, using legal and economic weapons to accomplish what military conquest had begun. The weight of historical responsibility pressed heavily on Marcus as he understood that their success or failure would influence similar battles across the country. Indigenous communities everywhere were watching to see whether traditional knowledge and sacred sites could be protected within modern legal and political systems. As October deepened and the first snows began dusting the higher elevations, Marcus knew that time was running short. Mountain Vista's political influence was building momentum for development approval, while Elena's health concerns added urgency to completing their documentation work before winter made fieldwork impossible. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Marcus had learned about bridging different worlds while remaining true to his cultural heritage. The outcome would determine not only the fate of his family's sacred land, but also the broader question of whether ancient wisdom could survive in a modern world driven by profit and development. The crisis reached its peak on a cold October morning, when Marcus discovered that Mountain Vista had begun preliminary clearing operations on the eastern boundary of the property. Despite pending legal challenges and incomplete archaeological reviews, heavy machinery sat just beyond their property line, and work crews were removing vegetation in preparation for access road construction. Elena reacted to this news with quiet fury that Marcus had never seen before. Her normally calm demeanor gave way to righteous anger, as she realized that Mountain Vista was gambling that legal proceedings would move too slowly to halt their development timeline. The company was betting that possession would become 9/10 of the law once construction began. Marcus immediately contacted Sarah Running Bear, who filed emergency motions for expanded injunctions while promising to arrive that afternoon with additional legal support. However, she warned that stopping machinery already in motion would require compelling evidence of immediate and irreparable harm to protected cultural resources. The legal battle intensified when Mountain Vista's attorneys argued that Elena and Marcus's claims were fraudulent attempts to extort money from legitimate developers. They presented their own expert witnesses who questioned the authenticity and significance of the archaeological discoveries, suggesting that any historical evidence had been planted or exaggerated. Dr. Thornton and her archaeological team worked frantically to complete their documentation while defending their findings against corporate-funded critics. The scientific debate played out in courtrooms and media outlets, with Mountain Vista's public relations machine portraying the conflict as obstructionist tactics by anti-development activists rather than legitimate cultural preservation efforts. The situation became more dangerous when Marcus encountered Mountain Vista security personnel conducting unauthorized surveys on the Red Hawk property itself. The confrontation nearly escalated to violence before Marcus managed to document their trespassing and force them to leave. But the incident demonstrated the company's willingness to break laws when they believed no one was watching. Elena's health continued to deteriorate under the constant stress, and Marcus found himself torn between protecting his grandmother and defending their sacred sites. She insisted on maintaining her regular ceremonial obligations despite her weakness, explaining that spiritual practice became more important during times of crisis rather than less. The breaking point came when Marcus and Elena discovered that someone had vandalized the medicine wheel site during the night, scattering stones and leaving deep tire tracks across the ceremonial circle. The destruction appeared deliberate and malicious, designed to damage both the archaeological evidence and the spiritual significance of the location. Elena's reaction to the vandalism surprised Marcus with its combination of grief and determination. She spent hours conducting cleansing ceremonies to repair the spiritual damage, while Marcus documented the physical destruction for legal proceedings. Her tears mixed with prayers as she worked to restore what generations of ancestors had created and maintained. The vandalism proved to be a tactical mistake by Mountain Vista, generating sympathy for Elena and Marcus, while providing clear evidence of criminal behavior associated with the development project. Media coverage shifted to focus on destruction of Native American sacred sites, bringing national attention to their struggle and attracting support from indigenous rights organizations. Sarah Running Bear used the vandalism incident to argue for expanded federal protection of the entire property under Emergency Cultural Resource Preservation Authority. She assembled a coalition of tribal governments, archaeological societies, and civil rights organizations to support their legal challenges while building political pressure on regulatory agencies. Mountain Vista responded by accelerating their own timeline, submitting revised development plans that claimed to avoid the most significant archaeological sites while proceeding with overall construction. Their strategy appeared designed to present local authorities with fait accompli that would be difficult to reverse once substantial investments had been made. The conflict reached national prominence when a documentary film crew arrived to record Elena's story for a program about indigenous cultural preservation. Elena initially resisted the publicity, preferring to handle the situation through traditional channels, but Marcus convinced her that broader public awareness might be their most effective weapon against corporate pressure. The filming process revealed Elena's remarkable knowledge and dignity to audiences far beyond their immediate community. Her explanations of the site's significance and their connection to living cultural traditions resonated with viewers who had never considered the ongoing importance of ancient sacred places. During one particularly powerful interview, Elena explained how the destruction of sacred sites represented a form of spiritual genocide that continued historical patterns of cultural suppression. Her words carried the authority of lived experience and traditional knowledge that no corporate spokesperson could match or dismiss. Mountain Vista's legal team made a critical error when they attempted to challenge Elena's credibility by questioning her mental competence and suggesting that elderly Native Americans were prone to confused thinking about historical events. The insulting strategy backfired spectacularly, generating outrage among tribal communities and their allies. Marcus watched his grandmother transform from victim to powerful advocate as she spoke truth to corporate power with eloquence that came from decades of surviving discrimination while maintaining cultural integrity. Her courage inspired him to find his own voice in defending their heritage against forces that seemed overwhelmingly powerful. The legal proceedings entered a crucial phase when federal archaeologists arrived to conduct independent evaluations of the disputed sites. Their findings would carry significant weight in determining whether the property qualified for protection under national historic preservation laws. As winter approached and the landscape prepared for its seasonal rest, Marcus realized that their struggle had become about more than protecting specific pieces of land. They were fighting to maintain space for indigenous worldviews in a society that increasingly valued only economic efficiency and technological progress. Elena's teachings about the interconnection of all life began to make deeper sense as Marcus understood how the destruction of sacred sites represented broader disconnection from natural systems that sustained both human communities and the earth itself. Their battle had implications that extended far beyond their family's immediate concerns. The approaching climax of their conflict would test everything Marcus had learned about courage, wisdom, and the price of maintaining cultural integrity in the face of overwhelming opposition. The outcome would determine whether ancient traditions could survive modern pressures and whether the voices of indigenous communities would be heard and respected in decisions affecting their sacred heritage. As the first serious snowfall began to dust the mountains, Marcus prepared for whatever confrontation lay ahead, knowing that his grandmother's teachings had prepared him for this moment when everything their family valued would be at risk. The time for compromise and accommodation was ending, and the moment for decisive action was at hand. The final confrontation began at dawn on a November morning, when Marcus discovered that Mountain Vista's construction crews had moved onto the disputed property during the night, positioning their equipment to begin clearing operations at first light. Despite multiple court orders and pending federal reviews, the company had decided to force the issue through direct action. Marcus woke Elena immediately, and they rushed to the construction site where workers were preparing to begin removing trees that had stood for decades around the sacred medicine wheel. The foreman, a weathered man named Patterson, showed them paperwork claiming authorization for emergency site preparation due to approaching winter weather. Elena positioned herself directly between the bulldozers and the medicine wheel, her small figure dwarfed by the massive machinery but unmovable in her determination to protect the sacred site. Marcus stood beside her, filming the confrontation on his phone while calling their lawyer and local media contacts. The construction workers seemed uncomfortable with Elena's presence, clearly recognizing the moral complexity of their situation, despite their legal authorization to proceed. Patterson repeatedly asked her to move for her own safety, but Elena remained motionless, explaining in both English and Lakota that she would not allow desecration of her ancestors' sacred ground. Within an hour, the scene had attracted tribal leaders, environmental activists, and media crews who formed a growing circle of protesters around the threatened sites. Sarah Running Bear arrived with additional attorneys and federal marshals carrying emergency injunctions that should have halted all construction activities. Mountain Vista's response revealed the depth of their political connections when company representatives produced contradictory federal authorization that appeared to supersede the injunctions. The legal confusion created a standoff between different law enforcement agencies, while bulldozers idled ominously near the archaeological sites. As tension mounted, Elena began singing traditional songs that her grandmother had taught her, her voice carrying across the meadow despite the rumble of machinery and shouting of various officials. Other tribal members joined her, creating a circle of prayer and ceremony that transformed the confrontation into something approaching sacred theater. The image of elderly Elena standing fearlessly before massive bulldozers while singing ancestral songs captured national attention when video footage spread across social media platforms. Within hours, the standoff had become a symbol of indigenous resistance to corporate colonization, drawing supporters from across the country. Marcus found himself thrust into the role of spokesperson and strategic coordinator as media interviews and legal proceedings demanded constant attention. He discovered leadership abilities he hadn't known he possessed, translating his grandmother's traditional knowledge into language that modern audiences could understand and support. The confrontation continued for 3 days as legal challenges moved through various court systems while protesters maintained their vigil around the sacred sites. Elena remained at the center of the resistance, her presence inspiring others while demonstrating the spiritual strength that had sustained indigenous communities through centuries of oppression. Mountain Vista's tactics became increasingly desperate as public opinion turned against them. Company representatives attempted to negotiate private settlements with individual protesters while spreading misinformation about the archaeological findings and questioning the protesters' legal right to occupy private property. The turning point came when Dr. Thornton released preliminary findings from her archaeological survey, revealing that the Red Hawk property contained one of the most significant pre-contact ceremonial complexes ever documented in the Northern Plains region. Her scientific analysis confirmed that the sites had been continuously used for over 1,000 years. Federal authorities arrived to take custody of the disputed property pending completion of comprehensive cultural resource evaluations. The archaeological evidence was deemed sufficiently significant to trigger automatic protection under multiple federal laws, effectively halting Mountain Vista's development plans indefinitely. Elena's response to their victory was characteristically humble, emphasizing that they had simply fulfilled their responsibility to protect what belonged to future generations, rather than accomplishing anything extraordinary. She insisted on conducting Thanksgiving ceremonies for all who had supported their struggle while offering prayers for healing between different communities. Marcus realized that their success had transformed him in ways he was still discovering. The corporate career that had once seemed important now felt hollow compared to the work of cultural preservation and community protection. He decided to remain on the family land permanently, dedicating himself to documenting and sharing traditional knowledge. The legal victory established important precedents for indigenous cultural rights while inspiring similar resistance movements across the country. Elena and Marcus's story became a template for communities facing threats to their sacred sites and cultural heritage from development pressures. Mountain Vista eventually withdrew their development proposal after facing mounting legal costs and continued negative publicity. The company's reputation suffered lasting damage from their aggressive tactics and disrespectful treatment of indigenous cultural concerns, affecting their ability to pursue similar projects elsewhere. Elena used her newfound prominence to advocate for broader protection of indigenous sacred sites and traditional ecological knowledge. She traveled to universities and conferences, sharing the wisdom she had learned from her own elders while encouraging young Native Americans to maintain their cultural connections. Marcus established a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting indigenous communities facing similar challenges to their own. His work combined traditional knowledge with modern legal and media strategies, helping other families protect their sacred places from development pressures. The property itself became a model for collaborative management between tribal governments and federal agencies, demonstrating how indigenous knowledge could enhance scientific understanding while maintaining appropriate cultural protocols. Educational programs brought visitors to learn about Plains Indian history and traditional ecological practices. As winter deepened and the anniversary of their struggle approached, Elena and Marcus reflected on how their confrontation with Mountain Vista had revealed both the continuing threats to indigenous communities and the power of traditional knowledge to guide modern resistance movements. Elena's health had stabilized during the months following their victory, as if successfully protecting the sacred sites had renewed her spiritual strength along with her physical vitality. She attributed her recovery to the support of ancestors who had guided their struggle and blessed their efforts. The relationship between Elena and Marcus had deepened through their shared experience of standing up to forces that seemed overwhelmingly powerful. Marcus had gained profound appreciation for his grandmother's wisdom while discovering his own capacity for leadership and cultural preservation work. Their story continued to inspire others facing similar challenges, proving that ordinary people could successfully resist corporate power when they combined traditional knowledge with modern advocacy strategies. The precedent they established helped protect sacred sites across Indian country. On quiet evenings at the cabin, Elena and Marcus often walked among the sites they had fought to protect, observing how the land itself seemed to have been renewed by their successful resistance. The medicine wheel stood intact, its ancient stones continuing to mark celestial cycles as they had for countless generations. Marcus had learned that the traditional saying was true. They were not fighting for themselves but for 7 generations in the future. Their victory ensured that children not yet born would be able to learn from sacred places that connected them to their ancestors and cultural heritage as snow covered the landscape and prepared it for spring's renewal. Elena and Marcus understood that their struggle had been part of an ongoing story of indigenous survival and resistance. They had added their own chapter while ensuring that the story would continue for generations to come. The land itself seemed to whisper gratitude in the wind through the pines, acknowledging that its protectors had proven worthy of the trust placed in them by ancestors who had faced their own impossible challenges and found the strength to preserve what mattered most for those who would follow.